we're going to hear from Stuart Waiton. Now, Stuart is a lecturer in sociology and criminology at Abertay University. He's a key player in No2NP persons who always says what he thinks. Journalists would call him an outspoken academic, but that's why we like him so much, and we're delighted to have him here today. Perhaps you'd like to give Stuart a round of applause as he comes up.
Okay, it's good to be here. My background a little bit, in case you don't know me at all, I suppose in terms of its relevance for the named person, is that for a long time I've been interested and concerned with the kind of regulation of everyday life. So areas of everyday life that seem to be more and more regulated in society. That's one of the things I'm interested in. And I disagree with Simon, and I think we've got to be careful with the way we pose things. Because if the Supreme Court had come back and said the named person's fine and dandy, I wouldn't accept that that's right. So just because the Supreme Court says we're right, I don't care really whether they say we're right or wrong, because I know we're right. Right? And they're actually wrong. The Supreme Court is wrong to say that the named person in principle is benign and entirely fine. It is not benign and entirely fine. And it's fundamentally a problem. In principle, I think it's dangerous, I think it's potentially authoritarian, and I think it undermines families and the idea of family and the idea of privacy. I think Maggie's going to talk a little bit more about that. The weird thing is about that is that if you went back about 20 years, and it's been developed over 20 years, if someone had said, everyone's going to have a named person from birth given to you by the state, they would have been seen as weird. Right? And now it's just reversed and become kind of common sense amongst so many people that this is weird to think there's something problematic about this when it's so fundamentally problematic. And I think fundamentally problematic to many people. Well-being, Simon mentioned the idea of well-being. The reason that that's important, that this has become the category now that is being promoted across all professions that relate to families, parents, children in any way, in terms of what they should be looking out for, the well-being of the child. The problem with this is that it is so subjective and broad a category and means almost anything. Right? Almost anything at all. It's a very therapeutic category as well, which means in many respects it's almost like a form of managing of your emotions, and the emotions and your relationships that you have with your children come under scrutiny through this category of well-being, which is the framework around how all of this works, and still is. I mean, that's the point. The data aspect of things might have changed, but the way that professionals and many, many politicians think and have been trained for the last generation, arguably, at least coming up to 2 decades, is around intervention based on this idea of well-being. Right? And that still is the case. So I think there's still a major problem in terms of how things will develop as we go forward. Another aspect of it, and this might be less familiar to some of you, but it's worth just Googling this and see what you find, is this idea of early intervention, because that's what underpins why this is happening. It's a kind of new mantra, and if you go and look at policy related to the family, social work, education, even policing, you go into all sorts of areas, and you find the most unusual people talking about early intervention, by which they mean most of the time, not all the time, getting in when someone is below the age of 3. Because if you don't get in then, and the parents have not been that nice and such and so whatever it is, the damage is already done. Early intervention. And it sounds almost logical, the idea of early intervention. But it's incredibly problematic. And the reason it's problematic, well, the name sort of gives it away, because it's early and it's intervention. Right? And it means earlier than what? Well, earlier than a serious problem is developed. So it means intervening before there's a serious problem. Right? And this is becoming the framework around which professionals across the board are being encouraged to get involved with family life. So to give you a kind of example, right, of how this works in the imagination, right? Say we have an axe murderer called Bob, right, in Scotland. We don't have too many, but we look at Bob's life and we trace it back. He did a bit of crime when he was a teen, he did this, did that. You keep tracing it back, and you'll find out that his mum shouted at him. She wasn't concerned about his self-esteem. She might have smacked him, blah, blah, blah. If only we'd got in early, Bob wouldn't have been an axe murderer. But that means that every parent who might shout at their kids, might not be the ideal parent, blah, 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 is being lumped in with Bob, the axe murderer. Right? This is the logic of early intervention, right? Which is incredibly problematic, that you start to look at the entire population through this prism. And never, or almost never, occasionally you do get some professionals, but almost never do you get a recognition by people promoting this that professional intervention might be problematic. That's one of the amazing sort of blind spots. Yeah, historically, it would have always been understood that intervention in the family is potentially problematic because of the nature of the family, the privacy, the autonomy, the authority that a parent needs within that framework. Today, there's almost no acceptance or recognition that professional intervention in a family's life might be problematic. It just seems to be a black hole in terms of the imagination of the people looking at this. So I think we've got a major problem. I think the political and the professional classes in Britain as a whole, in fact, you can look at this in America, it's developed in most Western countries, are of this mindset. So regardless of the data aspect of this, I think we've still got a major fight on our hands. And I'm going to read you a quote. Right? You don't shout out, but you can come up to me afterwards and say, I knew who that was. Right? I'm going to read you a quote, and you have to see if you know who's speaking. This is the quote. In the end, getting parenting and the early years right isn't just about the hardest to reach families. It's about everyone. We all have to work at it. And if you don't have a strong support network, if you don't know other mums and dads, having your first child can be enormously isolating. Of course, they don't come with a manual. Later on, as you'll see, he's basically giving us a manual. But anyway, of course, they don't come with a manual. But is it right that all of us get so little guidance? We've made progress. We've dramatically expanded the number of health visitors, and that's crucial. But that just deals with one part of parenting, the first few weeks and months. What about later on, when it comes to play, communication, behavior, and discipline? We all need more help with this. The most important job you'll ever have. So I believe we now need to think about how to make it normal, even aspirational, to attend parenting classes. Do you know who that was? That was David Cameron, Conservative Prime Minister, not Nicola Sturgeon, not a nannying New Labour, Tony Blair type person. That was David Cameron making that point. So I think we have got a major problem on our hands when you look at that. This suggests to me that in many respects we should thank the Scottish Government because they've exposed where we're going in society with this. And they've gone too far this time. They pushed it too far so that there was a reaction. And people here and others have reacted to this. But this is the trend that we have to recognize is very powerful amongst the political and the professional classes. And we have to keep pushing and refusing to allow them to patronize us and to undermine the family. Thank you.